welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello, everyone. Today we are joined by Matt Greenway, who is also known as the Saxon Storyteller, who is you will all have interacted with his art at least, because he's the guy who's also making art for our podcast. So welcome, Matt.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's been a while. I've been pestering you for a little bit. I know you weren't too sure.
No, just leave me under my stone.
Just hide away and just work away on artwork.
Yeah, that's it.
Get me messaging you last minute, like, Matt, quickly, we need this for the episode.
12-hour notice. It's my usual deadline from this lot, but it's fine. I don't mind that.
Not bitter at all.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, your popularity seems to have grown so much. I mean, obviously you're a personal friend of mine anyway, so I've seen you, or at least known your work from the start. When you went, I'm not sure how soon to when you started doing it, but I don't think it was too far off anyway when you popped up and I start seeing your artwork, and the difference between then and now is night and day. I can't think of another artist that does this style stuff that I've seen that has improved and changed and just kind of it's just full credit. It's just incredible. I think the journey, and it's been fun to watch your journey as you've obviously clearly learned so much about the artwork as you've gone through and taken your own style.
Yeah, well, it's not like a tradition. Like, I think I've been able to progress because it's more like my version of it. So I don't really do any of the normal Viking designs. So I don't do any of the normal stylized imagery that you usually see. So in that way, I'm not being too constricted. So I can just knock out whatever I like. So that's a really easy part of it. And then the color thing is just something else that I seem to have worked into. It seems to work quite well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it still has to. It has to work though. You're. I know you say it's not typically following the Nordic art style, as you say, but it still works. It still fits. It still looks right. You still follow the rules that you're meant to follow, but have your own twist on it. Yeah,
it's all like retelling or churning up the sagas and stuff, or reinterpretations of historic artifacts is one of the things I like to do. But yeah, I don't have to. Yeah, as I'm not doing any of the sort of traditional knot work, it's a lot more. The playing field's a lot more open for me to do what I like with it. Like with the Sacred Knot guys, they still work with the traditional sort of boundaries and telling the story, whereas I can sort of slap any draw what I like really without any sort of confines of the traditional art form. So I think that's what's the easiest thing. It allows me to churn out a bit easier. I don't have to follow too much.
Yeah, you can do some Lord of the Rings stuff.
Yeah. That was crazy. People seem to really like that, which is nice. I need to do some more. I'm just violently lazy.
Too busy getting pinned down by me, Matthias, asking you to do stuff.
Last minute podcast covers, yeah. No, it's work life. Work life balance is just chaos. So I haven't not worked. So I worked all the way through lockdown. I wasn't furloughed or anything. So my real job carried on. And got worse. So I haven't really had the chance. I've lost even more free time to do stuff. So it's just as and when I can really at the moment.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. It's never ending. So.
Yeah. We're moving, all the instruction online and stuff out of the classroom. I sort of I'm part-time teacher, part-time, the guy you call up an Apple and bitch to about your computer, and the person like responding on a message site somewhere like for customer services. I want to talk to the manager and all that crap. That's been my life the last year.
Just putting it with students.
Well, I mean, like it's not so much like putting up with students. It's more actually. It's the technology and the framework. Like the students, they ask reasonable questions and have reasonable problems. It's more just like you're all of a sudden like now I know just how fucking annoying I've been in situations where I've been trying to talk to customer service somewhere.
Do you think people try to get away with more because it's not face to face and it's all kind of Zoom based? Do you think they push it a little bit more?
Oh hell yeah.
Really?
Like if I'm teaching a class, you'll see, like, so I teach two types of classes, 30 students or 160 students, right? The 30 students, there'll be some who, like, you know, drop out like during the progress of the Zoom class, right? So 50 minutes in, or it's 50 minutes, like 30 minutes in, you'll see a couple of people just disappearing because they already took attendance, right? And that's just how it goes. By the end, wow, you're sitting there with a handful. And when we come to like the big lecture classes with 160 students, it's hilarious. Like half of them don't. Well, no, is more like 3 of them have their cameras on, the rest of them don't, and I'm pretty sure half of them are asleep.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would.
Exactly, right?
That's exactly what I'd do, so I'm sure other people are.
Yeah, no, the only reason I'm awake is because I'm jacked up on caffeine anyway, so.
Yeah, for sure. So Matt, obviously you are called the Saxon Storyteller. Yeah. Where did that come from? Why Saxons? Because obviously there's so many people. Obviously you do like Nordic artwork as well.
Yeah,
but
I have to.
Well, yeah, I imagine that's supply and demand.
Yeah.
So yeah, where did the name Saxon come and why the focus on that?
It was always going to be. There's always going to be Anglo Saxon. I prefer Anglo Saxon over any of the other Northern European art. Obviously, there is correlation, and they do butt up against each other. Somebody's probably spoken about like Vendelier and stuff. It all comes from a root point anyway. But the Anglo Saxon itself, like the cloisonné artwork and Germanic style one. So even the early Anglo Saxon, I've always been more drawn to. And then, I just started uploading stuff to Facebook, and the comments, whenever you upload something, it gives you like a name, like new author, and it gave me visual storyteller. So I just nicked that, added Saxon to it, because no one would Google Anglo Saxon Storyteller, because that's just a pain in the ass. And then I just stuck Saxon Storyteller to it. I get a lot of people thinking I'm from Germany, though. So I get a lot of people like trying to speak to me in German, think I'm from the Saxon regions. So, no, I'm from England. So, that's what it started off as originally. And I try to do as much Anglo-Saxon as I can, but the stuff that's there is quite scant in the way that you could put into imagery. So it's a lot like cloisonné, enamel, like mosaic style brooch work. The early stuff you can sort of just draw up, but it's not very much of it. I think the Vendel plates only have like 8, maybe 10 designs in total, and then they sort of like copy each other. So that's why I can do as much Nordic stuff, but it's mostly like the sagas, just reimagining the sagas. Redrawing the sagas and that, but that's the majority of the sort of stuff I'm doing. Yeah,
I've personally been trying to draw some bracteates lately.
Yeah,
and they are funky, like visually, and the way that the image is composed. They're like all these weird details. And Dana, you're gonna ask, what is it?
You saw my mouth move, and you got there before me. We've been doing this long enough now, I think.
Yeah, so bracteates are these medallions, golden medallions usually, from the period 400 to middle of the 500s. They weren't in use for that long, actually.
It's migration era, isn't it, mostly?
Yeah. And like I actually have some images right here, if you can see.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're sort of like a Germanic take on Roman medallions that the Roman legionnaires would be carrying on their armor. And it's very obvious, like there's some funky stuff going on in the translation between that sort of like prototype, the Roman prototype, and then into the Germanic stuff, because these Germanic warriors who seem to have been wearing them as pendants in a necklace, I think. They, first of all, they have like some like weird, like really deep esoteric religious connotations to them. Like, this is some of the first imagery that we can actually connect to Nordic mythology. Like the death of Balder, for instance, seems to be depicted on one of them. Tyr having his hand bit off is also depicted on one of them. So there's like straight connections to Nordic mythology in different ways. But aside from that, we have runic inscriptions on them, we have swastikas on them, and then what we usually have is a giant head riding on a really weird horse, and often also two ravens hanging out. Like, that's also a very common theme.
Okay.
And yeah, like the guys who were carrying these around, they were like, have you ever seen Apocalypto, that Mel Gibson movie about yeah.
No,
So I don't know. I don't know. Okay, so Matt, I don't know if you remember the scene where like they're doing the whole human sacrifice with like pulling people's hearts out of their chests and all that stuff on top of the pyramid. And then they take that heart and they throw it in the fire. And then there's like some guy who's like sitting there and like going into some kind of trance while like inhaling the smoke. I kind of feel like this is the same way that those Germanic warriors wearing those pendants, those Bractiate pendants, they would have been just generally reacting to things. Like it's so funky. Like, so much of that stuff that's going on in those images, so funky. It's sometimes it's really hard to see what it actually is that they're trying to depict, and it's almost deliberate too, because these people, they know the Roman medallions. The Romans, their style is very naturalistic, right? They depict basically the image that they create more or less corresponds to some kind of reality, right? Those Germanic funky dudes, they're all over the place. It's just like it's like some kind of like, I don't know, modern art sometimes.
Yeah, I've always liked it. Like, there's like the proper ambiguity to it. You don't know, because like the Roman stuff is like literal and realistic. And I know what you mean. The medallions are just, and they're weird as well. They look like if you're looking at something on an acid trip. Like, the faces are all sort of like, it's like very 20th century like surrealism, because it's not like a true face. It's all like it's melting back. It's weird. We'll put up a few photos, I think, to show people. But it is very like, if they could have, it is deliberate, because they could definitely made them. We've seen them stuff they can produce, that they could make something as realistic, probably. Like, they had the craftsmen, but they are just really surrealistic pieces. And I think it's the ambiguity in the artwork, which was a deliberate thing. So that it was an insider knowledge. It must have been like insider knowledge, where that clan, that tribe would have known what that piece was doing, or that person knew what it was, but for everybody else outside of it, a bit like the bind rune has sort of become nowadays, where it has its own internalized meaning, and it's only for that wearer or that person to really truly know what it is. I think that's similar to that sort of like scenario.
That's a good that's a good comparison. I like that. Yeah.
I mean, you assume that there would be different art styles amongst the art that's going on. Obviously, I know with like Nordic art, you have like your main art styles, but surely, at the end of the day, we're talking about humans. So there's going to be like that one guy or that one girl who's like, I want to fucking do this and just do something completely different. And it might not catch on, but it still might survive. And it might just happen to be the one thing that we find. And it could just be the Salvador Dali or the Picasso of the Vikings. Surely those people must have existed though within any style of art. There has to be those outliers who are like, I'm going to do something completely different.
What you're saying is that there's somewhere out there from like the migration era in the Rhineland area, we're going to be finding a bunch of like really, really like intricate naturalistic art, like just, somewhere in a field. But all of what we've found so far is like the crazy Picasso guy from that period.
Just churn it out.
No, I think one of the interesting things with the Bractiates is that they often include the word alu, which has like this dual meaning. You might recognize it in the word ale. It seems to mean alcoholic, intoxicating drink. Probably beer, but possibly could also relate to wine or mead, or who knows. And then it also probably means magic, right? So there's like this dual meaning to it. Like I'm fucked up on something right now, and it's totally magic.
Well, that would explain why they were.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
That'd explain the melty faces then.
It could, right? Like that's what Matt was just saying. Like it looks like an acid trip, right?
Yeah, it's weird. It's the weirdest sort of faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely have to pull them up. So, Mathias, just to, and this is a little bit pre-Viking Age, I guess. So the Saxons came from Germany or Germanish. That area of what we know now as Germany. So how come everyone thinks of like early English people as being Anglo-Saxon? Like that's what you tend to hear when anybody speaks about like pre-Christian England. It's always Anglo-Saxon. But sure, that's like half Germanic. So it's not really.
Yeah, no, this is going to be fun because this is also a major controversy. Lately, it has
I'm going to pretend that I planned that question then. And I'm not really just that thick.
So the thing is, lately in medieval studies, in Old English studies, especially here in the US, certain scholars have been questioning whether or not we should call it Anglo-Saxon in the first place, whether or not that is appropriate, especially because in an American context, Anglo-Saxon has also for a long time been sort of like cultural code for like pasty white dude, and been an exclusionary term.
It's also been picked up by like white supremacy groups as well, because you get like WASP, that whole like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant vibe.
Yeah.
So you get that as well.
Yeah. And there's something to be said for a cultural standard that you sort of like adhere to here in the US that is like Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant defined, which is actually a minority compared to the ethnic background of most people in this country. Like just think about the fact that like 51 million Americans consider their primary heritage German. That's the largest group. Then you have 36 million Americans who consider their primary heritage Irish. So like the English, that whole thing comes like way down somewhere around 15 million or something like that. So that says a lot about cultural identities in general, and also how cultural identity is formed in context of like a primary established ideal, right? So
how much of that is based on like a genetic level of what's somebody, because I feel like some people, they'll be like, they like to be one thing or the other. So like if they have like they might identify as being Irish or Viking.
But think about
but is it just them going, oh well, I heard my grandfather's Irish, so I'm going to now identify as being Irish, or is it an actual genetic thing?
So speaking about like white Americans, like the vast majority of white Americans are mixed ethnicities from Europe, right? So it's not just one.
It's not very cool to be English, I don't think.
No, actually,
like that's why I asked the question, because I feel like if you had the option of being like Irish, English, like people just don't really like us.
Well, but that's another thing. Like, it didn't used to be that cool to be Irish, you know.
Well, absolutely not. No.
And the same with German, especially in an American context. Go back 100 years, and like being German sucked, right? And in the same way, back 100 years ago, like Italians were targeted by the KKK, and there was like, you know. I just saw somebody posting about this on Facebook, actually, an old newspaper cutout from somewhere where it said that the local town council had voted not to employ a company to build the main street or something like that in the town if they hired Italians, right? So like those things were also happening, right? And Italians were also being excluded at that time. Scandinavians were also considered like these weird northern barbarians that should probably just stay over there in their little weird village. Those kinds of things. So that's really the history of the U.S. Like, that idea of like who's part of the in crowd, and that means white in America. That has like been expanding through the 20th century, but started being very exclusionarily defined as English, right? That was the thing. That's the core of it. So everybody has like adhere to that English standard, become as waspy as possible. And there's also another trend, old trend from the 19th century in the US, and that is the adherence to the idea of like French knightly ideals and all that stuff. That's for the South, right? So you'll find, because a big portion of the South was a French colony at one point, like Louisiana. And that's where you will find white people traditionally having associated with like French history. But yeah, so that's part of that background of why there's a conversation about how you can use the term Anglo-Saxon, or if you can use it at all. And it is very much an American conversation. Like in the UK, you have a little bit of a different attitude to this. There are some who feel aligned with what we're seeing some American medieval scholars on the English realm saying about this. They're basically saying we shouldn't use Anglo-Saxon, we should say Old English instead. And you see some English scholars being the same way, like, yeah, let's say Old English instead of Anglo-Saxon. And then you also see a lot of pushback because, in England, it's a marker of identity too. The question is if it's exclusionary identity, if it really relates that much to how people thought of themselves back in those so-called Anglo-Saxon days. What we're seeing is that there is some tendency after Alfred the Great for kings, and I think also Alfred himself, to refer to themselves as Rex Anglo-Saxorum, so king of the Anglo-Saxons, as I think perhaps an inclusionary term in itself, right? But there are these distinct ethnicities, Angles and Saxons at least, and if we go to Beta, we also see Jutes. That would be people like me. So there is a portion of Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula that have also migrated over with the Angles and Saxons, right? But Saxony proper is this like curious area that stretches from where Hamburg is today and sort of like down past Berlin to like the corner over there. Bypassing Thuringia and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern on the northeastern side of things, and we have Niedersachsen. That's the area around like Hamburg and a big area around northern Germany, Niedersachsen, and that was its own kingdom and its own ethnicity in the 700s. The guy who fucked that up was Charlemagne. He invaded in the 770s, and because he was like, these people need Christianity, because they didn't have Christianity at the time, right? So he invades, and that's like just an excuse to take over a landmass that's right next to his own kingdom. He does the same thing to Thuringia, right? Bavaria and so on, even Lombardy in northern Italy. And so that's how then the Saxons become included in the idea of like Germans, like slowly. Of course, they exist as their own ethnicity, then later on as their own dialect and so on. It's still, its own dialect in so many ways as like Blattdeutsch.
So
and Karina is pointing out that many Germans still think Saxon is his own kingdom.
So I'm struggling to understand what the issue is with using the word Anglo-Saxon.
So the whole idea is that, especially as I said in an American context, this Anglo-Saxon means white person and cannot include non-whites. That's part of it. In a cultural context, and so that's why. So
so it's not necessarily that it's not the right term, because that's not, because I feel like when we started this, that's where it was going. That it was that for some reason that they didn't agree with that term because it was just technically wrong. It just wasn't.
So
right in that sense.
Technically, what you can see in the source material is. It's not a prevalent tendency in Old English sources to combine Angles and Saxons into Anglo-Saxon. What you see often is just Saxons.
I think it's because it's used now as a modern racial identifier. So now it's developed connotations. But I personally have no issue with it. I don't know if I can argue as a white guy, but I think if you start calling it Old English, too many people are going to confuse it as the Chaucer era of like middle medieval. I think people say Old English and they think of like sort of post-Norman conquest, but I think Anglo-Saxon as a historical identifier, it still works so well. Like it's still people know it as Alfred, but I think outside of a racial identifier, I think if you start referring to it as Old English, I think many people will think of the knights and later periods like post 1100s and stuff. And I think Anglo-Saxon has to remain, for now, historically, as a historical matter, has to remain as like the main identifier of that period. Even if they didn't refer to themselves, it doesn't really matter. We refer to the Bretons and the Celts, and I mean, I think we've had Brock on before. So the Celts as an identifier is pretty much bollocks anyway, because there's multiple different blood groups anyway. But I think once again, it's like with academia, where the modern view of things is mixed up to the point where it sort of sullies original meanings, and obviously it can't be helped if it's used with negative connotations, but I don't think we can change a meaning that quite a lot of people can't understand the Anglo-Saxon as an era of historicity.
So I want to add something to this. Old English over here will be confused with a really shitty malt beer. But aside from that, there's something to be said for asking, well, when did these terms become established as like terminology that we use about like this specific group and that time period and so on. And there's something to be said for the fact that like Anglo-Saxon is very much a construction too, in different ways. I have recently been on a crusade to make people stop saying Norse about everything that comes from fucking up there, because it's really a misnomer in so many ways. Like Norse, it is like a late 16th century English word for Norwegian. That has been under influence from Dutch and possibly also Danish, and to like and then later on in like English antiquarian interest and so on, this word starts becoming applied to the language, the West Nordic dialect in which like the saga literature is written and all that stuff. Like, so that's like Old Norse, which is, you know, a dialect that emerges in the 1100s. It's like if you ever use the word Norse about somebody in the Viking Age, then you're wrong. Like this is plain, basically wrong, because that Norse didn't exist at that point. It comes later on, and so like that's a construction nowadays. And you can see like there's plenty of scholarly material that uses Norse frivolously. It's like fucking Danes are called Norse once in a while. I'm like, that's just a misnomer altogether. The same with like, the Swedes and so on. And so what the problem is of course then that we can lack clarity, and we can get like these weird constructions where, you know what, if I was Icelandic and somebody referred to my old Icelandic literature stuff as Norse, I'd get pissed off.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want those fucking Norwegians to come and hog it all. Like, so that's how this terminology can also get exclusionary in different ways. And
so, Matthias, I was trying to pull you back to because I think most people, or you see very commonly, the Old Norse, people say, well, that's what the Vikings spoke. Whenever they talk about, translating anything into runes, it's like translating to Old Norse and then into runes. And it seems like commonly accepted that like people in the Viking Age spoke Old Norse. And you just said that they didn't. So I feel like that's an important thing you can't just skim over.
Yeah. So in the Scandinavian languages, we actually have a distinct way of talking about these languages. So the Viking Age language, and again, like you can also go, can we even talk about a Viking Age, right? And then we start like deconstructing everything. You can talk about a Viking Age. It's from 700 to 1100, period. And what language are they speaking? Well, in Danish and Norwegian, we would call that Oldnordisk. And that means Old Nordic. And that's generally a common language. There are a few dialectical differences between, the different places in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic where this language is spoken. But it's a common language. And then it starts branching out in the 1100s, become West Nordic and East Nordic. And this is where people are like, oh, Norse, West Norse, East Norse. No, West Nordic, East Nordic. You can call the West Nordic dialect Norse, but then you would be glossing over differences between Old Icelandic and Old Norwegian, Old Faroese, and also the Greenlandic Nordic language, right? Because they do have distinct differences in different ways.
Is that the same if you said Anglo-Saxon, though? Because obviously with the multiple kingdoms before it became a singular kingdom, Northumbrian, Wessex, Mercian, like the dialects were different enough that when scholars came to sort of cross-reference and try and write stuff up. I mean, with Beowulf, as we get onto later, that I think if I remember rightly, it's a Wessex. They think it's a Wessex writer of the manuscript, but they think it might be from a different thing, and they've completely fucked up the translations. And that happens quite a lot. That even just within England itself, or what became England, like the dialects were so different that even to class it technically as Anglo-Saxon, when you're looking at areas where it was Angles and Saxons, but you got the Jutes as well. Then even it's a misnomer, but it's a hard one to sort of like, yeah.
And that's the thing, right? Because we have these different kingdoms. Yeah. They seem to have had different identities in different ways. You can always ask, like, where does one identity begin and another one stop? And that always comes down to like also the people. Where do they consider themselves being a distinct identity in different ways? Going back, I'm
sure they didn't consider it anywhere near as much as we do in modern day, because they had shit to deal with and were busy not dying.
Yeah. So, we'd all be dead by now.
Yeah, they didn't just sit talking on a podcast about who identifies as what. It was, I don't think they had time to kind of consider that stuff. And usually, probably what whoever was ruling the land told you were, and you kind of accepted it.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the thing. The whoever was ruling the land was not particularly busy telling you what identity to belong to.
Oh no,
they were more. They were telling you what to do, and especially what to pay, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That was what they were worried about, taxes, right? They didn't give a shit about nations and stuff like that.
Of course not. They cared about the land they owned and what other land they could go and take.
Exactly. So, and then you have like these different people, right, in a region or a village or whatever, generating their little identity there, right?
Mm-hmm. I think, again, that's something we need to remember, not to put our modern ideas and the way we think today onto the way people would have thought back then and be like, oh, they would have thought this, when no, they just wouldn't. So you said that they obviously, I mean, it's quite obvious that they would have had different languages in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and obviously in England. How easy would they have been able to communicate with each other? Like, how different would the Scandinavian languages been? Would it be that you could kind of figure it out, or would you have to learn it? Would you take a translator?
In the Viking Age, or later?
Let's say in the Viking Age.
So in the Viking Age, if you were from Denmark and you found yourself in northern Norway, talking to some other, let's just call them Viking, right? They would be able to understand each other. There wouldn't be a problem.
It's close enough to understand.
It's not close enough. It's like literally almost the same language.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah,
okay,
it's that close. The same with Iceland. The same with Sweden. Like and this is also the same with English at the time.
That's the thing. It's with you. I just didn't want to confuse people by you saying, these different languages, and then getting that idea that the completely difference in the way that it's like English and French today, where you just kind of, I mean, certainly for me, just look a little bit confused, speak slower, and put a French accent on it.
There are differences.
Like you get it with romantic languages as well. So Portuguese can understand Italian, French, and Spanish. It's not always like vice versa. So it's more dialectal than it is like language as such sometimes. Because as long as it's a root, I think you've got Germanic root in all those languages. Or I don't know if that's the best describer, but yeah.
Yeah. So what we're seeing with the let's just call it the Anglo Saxon language. Okay. Hopefully we won't get a lot of problems with that, but let's just call it that. Like, so if you have some person from Norway coming over in the 800s and they start talking to you're let's say you're a Northumbrian farmer, you would be able to understand each other. There would be cases where you'll be misunderstanding each other because there's like tenses on verbs, conjugations, and so on. But largely, if I wanted to sell my horse to you, you would understand that I'm selling my horse to you. You might think there were two horses, but contextually, if you're only seeing one, then you'd be like, oh, it's one horse.
Yeah.
Because that would be like the differences here.
Fair enough. So jumping ahead of ourselves, obviously after this, we're going to record the first watch-long show for the Vikings series that we're doing. Now, when I watched that, and they went when people from like the quote unquote Vikings came over to England and spoke to the Anglo Saxons, I was always thinking that was absolute bullshit. I was like, fuck that, they won't understand them. What the fuck's going on here? But it seems maybe I was wrong for thinking that, and they would have actually been able to at least kind of get the grasp of what was happening.
Absolutely, they would be able to do more than just getting grasps. Like, they would be able to talk with each other in their distinct languages and largely understand each other. As I said, there will be grammatical issues and some conjugation or syntactical issues that would make it like there would be sort of like the cause for misunderstandings, right? You wouldn't be able to be as precise, but yeah.
That's blown my mind because I watched 9 series of that thinking it was fucking bullshit. I was like, this is bullshit. No way could they have spoke to each other. I thought that was going to be the most ridiculous thing about the show, but apparently
it's actually one of the most realistic things.
It's really not.
But that happens now, though. Like, if we went back a generation or two, like if my great grandfather from the south spoke to Daniel's great grandfather from Yorkshire, like it'd be a fucking hard conversation, but you just about get along. Like, it's dialectal. Like, it's a dialect more than anything else. Like Yorkshire now is confusing, but Yorkshire like 100 years ago would have been more confusing. So I think it's the same sort of like similarity between the northern languages of that sort of era as well.
Oh, I think even in like 2 generations ago, just like like Sarah's sort of family are all like proper like Yorkshires you would get, and kind of like mill workers and that kind of thing. And when they like speak to each other, I'm sometimes like, what the fuck are these words? And like, there's letters being missed out here and there, and that's kind of disappearing now, I think. Yeah. But even just a generation ago, there was such a difference that some of it's like,
you have no idea the ridiculous differences there are in like the Jutland Peninsula that I'm from in Denmark. Like traditionally, like, you go an hour away from Aarhus, where I'm from. Like, Aarhus is like the main town on the peninsula, right? Go an hour away, and then like the person that you would be talking to, if it's an elder person, you don't understand the thing that they're saying. Like, it's completely gibberish. But some of these things also come down to like, how easy is it for you as an individual, right, to absorb that language that you're hearing? Like, how easy is it for you to translate the phonemes that are being thrown at you, right, into the phonemes that you're comfortable with? Like, for instance, theoretically, Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish are interchangeable. Like, they're just dialects of the same language, right? But there's plenty of language speakers in those different countries that when they're faced with their neighboring language, they're like, what the fuck is this person saying? I mean, I had the greatest situation with that when I was at Midgårdsblot in Norway in 2019. And somebody asked me where I was from, and I was trying to say the USA. And they I was just saying those USA in Danish to this Norwegian person, and they never ever managed to understand what I was saying, like these three letters, because it's just like the pronunciation difference can be so big between Danish and Norwegian, right? So
how different are those three letters than in English?
So Danish, USA.
Fuck off! I would have fucking got that, and I'm a moron. I really didn't understand that.
So to a Norwegian, that's or to some Norwegian dialects, that sounds like an O and an S and an E instead. So that's like quite a shift in phoneme.
I mean, Matthias, I don't think this was a dialect issue. I think this might have been an intellect issue. I mean, I don't want to offend the person. But...
You see, what I'm staying open to is the possibility. And that sometimes you're so entrenched in your language situation that it can be difficult for you to sort of like shift to, you know, a slightly different sound, right?
Karina just said that it could have been an alcohol issue, which would make sense at Midgårdsblot as well.
That is also a possibility.
All right, let's jump into the bulk of the episode, I guess. The most famous of all Anglo-Saxon sagas, I guess, or poems would be Beowulf. Everyone's seen the Ray Fiennes film with the Angelina Jolie cartoon character, I guess. It seems an odd for me, who I know absolutely nothing about it. It seems odd that it's or it appears to be at least an Anglo-Saxon poem that is based on Vikings and in like Scandinavia, which seems a little bit strange, I guess.
Yeah.
Matthias,
well,
it's smiling.
It's not Viking, but like it's the longest Anglo-Saxon manuscript. It's the longest manuscript we have in Anglo-Saxon. Well, it's the longest poem. It's a singular manuscript, so it doesn't exist outside of the singular copy we have. But there is Latin-based manuscripts. There are other poems as well, but it's the longest one we have. It's got like the most kennings for different things. It's the most in-depth, because the Anglo-Saxons loved poetry and loved like wordplay, wordsmithing. But the actual Beowulf itself is one of the longest we have, and it goes so in depth into the culture that I think that's why it became so famous. And it's nothing to do with Vikings. I think it predates them ever so slightly. It definitely predates the Danish invasions or the Nordic invasions into England, definitely, just by its writing. But yeah, it's nothing to do with Vikings as such. It's to do with the Northern Europeans. I think it's the best way to describe it. Yeah. Yeah, nothing.
So there's a couple of things to say about that. There's been a long discussion in scholarship, because the manuscript itself is from the 11th century, as far as I remember.
Discovery was in the 11th century, I think it was, yeah.
Yes, we can date the manuscript to the 11th century.
Yeah.
And the question is then, was there a version that existed before the 11th century or not? That's like the most tiresome debate that we always have in medieval studies when it comes to literature. It's like, was there a version of this text that existed prior to the one that I have right here? Like, for instance,
would that be like a written version, or would you just mean version in general, oral included?
Could be both. Could be both. Like, it really depends on a lot of things. Like, so here's a great example. Like Snorri Sturluson's Edda, one of my prime sources to Nordic mythology, right? None of the manuscripts that we have are actually from Snorri's time. Like the oldest one is a century younger than Snorri Sturluson's time of writing, approximately. So that just tells you something about like how it's always like an issue when it comes to manuscripts, and it's also, you know, if you ask me, quite frankly, a pretty boring issue. But that aside, so question
it seems a silly issue, because you would have to assume that the person who penned the writing was the person who created the story, and they sat there and wrote it, and it was their original idea, not that it was like an oral tradition that passed through and somebody wrote down the story.
Well, why can't we assume that it was an oral story that existed before the person writing it down?
No, that's what I mean. That's
Okay.
I assume that seems like the most logical answer, rather than it being that whoever wrote it down was a novelist that came up with this original idea and just sat there and wrote it down, and it never existed anywhere else before they did that.
That makes a lot of sense. But it's not necessarily logical to weirdos like me who have spent like decades studying this shit, because and there can be many different reasons, but here's a great example with the sagas, right? There used to be like two main theories on the sagas. There's the book prose theory and the free prose theory. The free prose theory is the idea that the saga literature was created primarily based on oral tales that were told for generations, and then they materialized to literature in Iceland. The book prose theory, on the other hand, basically stipulated that this was a type of literature that was created in the medieval period. They were primarily just like looking back to like little elements of knowledge that they had from like the time period when people migrated to Iceland, but they're creating it in the 1200s, where they're sitting there with their literary genius and writing all of these awesome tales. Okay, question. Who do you think, when it comes to scholars, right? Like, if you look at, like, say, Norwegian and Icelandic scholars, like, the Norwegian scholars, which theory do you think they would be favoring? And what theory do you think the Icelandic scholars would be favoring? Book prose or free prose?
Yeah.
What was the question again?
Okay, so when it comes to like free prose theory, who do you think would be on that one? The idea that these are ancient tales that have been told through generations and then written down in Iceland. Do you think that this would be something that Norwegian scholars would like, or Icelandic scholars?
I think that Icelandic scholars would think that they created them and wrote them down.
Mm-hmm,
and
exactly.
Norwegians would be more of an oral.
Yes, exactly. Because the Norwegian scholars like the idea of these sagas having root in a Norwegian storytelling tradition.
I've got fucking sweaty palms now. I felt like I was getting quizzed. I felt like I was back at high school and I was panicking.
Yeah. I'm very much being a teacher right now. and that's the thing, right? So the book prose theory was very favored by Icelandic scholars in the 20th century in general, because what it really then said was that this is Icelandic literature. This is fucking awesome, right? And so sometimes
trying to claim an identity as a new, as a new nation, you want to claim these things as yours and give yourself some history almost.
Absolutely, that's definitely part of it, and there's a lot of things to be said about that. But the whole point is, like, the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we're talking about those like medieval manuscripts and whether or not the story was created when somebody put that pen to the vellum, not the paper, the vellum, which was cowskin or calfskin or sheepskin, or if it existed prior, right? That sometimes also comes down to ideology, right? The scholars' ideology, what kind of ideological environment are the scholars actually like existing in, and so on. Sometimes it also comes down to a theoretical approach. Are we dealing with like positivism? Are we dealing with hermeneutics? Like all that crap. And really what that means then is that there is a big debate of whether or not Beowulf is from the 11th century or from like the, I don't know, 8th, 7th century.
Or even earlier, I've heard.
And even earlier.
Yeah. Like the way I, like personally, I think I see it as, so it's a Christian, it's definitely like from a Christian perspective, looking back on the old heathen Beowulf, because it even makes claims, like it's quite Christian throughout, it mentions Christian elements, but I think quite a lot of people want it to be Bede, because everything comes from the era of Bede. You've got like Frank's casket, but it's definitely pre-King Alfred. I think it's pre-Alfred, because it's the Danes are still favoured. Like it's like the Danes and the Swedes are still seen like favourably, so it's got to be pre-Danish invasion. So yeah, I think that sort of era is probably better. I mean, definitely Christian, like Christianized area of Anglo-Saxon era, or definitely written down in the Anglo-Saxon Christian era. But yeah, definitely pre-Alfred reign. I think Bede's area I think looks best as a sort of best area, which I think is that 700s. I think it's 700.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Would that lean more towards it being maybe a pre-Christian story that's then been
100%.
that's then been written down by a Christian, and they've probably just penned in a few little bits here and
Just
there?
the theme itself. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are several references to what appears to be some common pre-existing mythology that you can see elements of in Beowulf and also in Nordic mythology. What are the brothers' names? Like there's like the Balder story is in there, but I can't remember what the brothers are called in Beowulf. Like there's like a reference to that in like just a little bit, like a couple of stanzas. Obviously, what we're also seeing is a similarity in conceptual poetry. You have kennings in Beowulf, just like we know them from skaldic poetry. Like the whale road for the ocean is a great example, which is conceptually exactly the same as the way that you make kennings in Nordic mythology and in skaldic poetry. And again, like going back to like these ideas like originalism and so on, right? So this brings up like questions for scholars like me and my peers, like, does that mean then that skaldic poetry sort of like has a genetic relationship to this poetry in Beowulf? Like, does it originate from there? Some would make that argument. Others would say that they belong to the same cultural sphere, and then you have sort of like a branching out here, and you have a branching out here. But that would be my favorite approach.
Okay.
And when we talk about this, like when does that poem come from? I agree with you, Matt, that it's probably from the 700s.
Yeah.
And I can't remember whose theory it is, but some scholar has this theory that it was actually revived after the treaty between Alfred and Guthrum as sort of like a way to be inclusive with Danes. And yeah, no, I like that theory a lot, actually, because especially if you think about it in general terms of like Alfred and his court being so focused on literature.
Yeah,
they were very interested in literature in general. They had a huge library too, so it would not be impossible for them to have an old text lying around.
Yeah, I think it's in the Wessex dialect as well, isn't it? It's written down in Wessex dialect originally.
As far as I know, yeah.
So to try and keep some sort of structure to this, Matthias, are you able to give us like a quick synopsis of? I don't know if that's the right word, but it sounded right. Do you know it? Of Beowulf, just so we have like an idea of the story, what it is.
Holy shit! I should have checked my cliff notes.
Because I guess what I'm most interested in is that it's obviously an Anglo Saxons poem, but it's set in Denmark, which seems quite peculiar, at least.
Yeah, so the whole debacle is that we have like this Danish king who's got a nice little cool hall called Herod, which means stag, and that's in itself quite interesting that it's a stag that we're dealing with, because there's so much stag symbolism in Denmark in general, like from the pre-Christian period. You find stags on coins and associated with the royal houses and all that stuff. So there's something to be said for the veracity as well, of like these references to sort of like more flimsy mythological contexts of the Danish area.
So that lean to them having at least some knowledge of that area.
Exactly.
It's not just they've picked, because that's what I was kind of thinking of. They just picked a land that they know exists. But
right,
it's almost a mythical land because they've not been there.
Like
so you
Shakespeare.
so you can write this story about it because
No, the people who composed this poem. I say the people because I consider it a multi-generational poem, right? I'm pretty sure they had specific knowledge about intricate Scandinavian social and cultural contexts. That's very obvious to me.
You see it in Anglo Saxon stuff. Like we have the artifacts. If you look at the raid wall on the Sutton Hoo, that was either Swedish. It was either a Swedish craftsman or of the Swedish variety of things. They would have had a trading network. That's pre-Christian, so the trading network between the Northern European people was quite like it was there, and there's evidence of it. So they would have known the Swedes. The Anglo-Saxon would have known the Swedes and back and forth. So
yeah. This is like another thing when we see like representations of Viking stuff and all that stuff. Like, oh, the Vikings came out of nowhere. No, they didn't. The Vikings were like, we know there are very rich ports right over there. Let's go raid them.
Yeah, that's something I think to maybe clear up this idea that the like the raid on Lindisfarne, I guess, is the one that's pinpointed as the start of the Viking Age. And I think maybe some people who don't know that much about this topic would just kind of go, oh, that's the first time they ever came to England. And that's like the first time they ever saw the Vikings. So I think it's quite important to clear that up and say, that's not, they were Scandinavians already in England.
And see, this is where I'm like, yeah, I understand the surprise that is expressed in this literature from the English area at this time, because it kind of seems like there used to be nice, peaceful trade, and then all of a sudden you see these like Viking ships coming, and you're standing there on the beach like waving happily, "Hi guys, let's trade," and then arrow right in your face. Like it's I mean, if anything, the surprise here is that it was a dick move on the Scandinavians to start raiding these ports instead of just trading that they used to,
Shouldn't have been flirting all that nice gold around, should they?
Well, maybe not.
If you're gonna tease with all the shiny jewels and gold, don't be surprised when someone comes and takes it.
So going back to the story, right? So this king in Denmark, he's got a problem, because there's this like monster that is harrowing his hall, and that's where Beowulf is then called to action. Beowulf is a Hwæt, so that is possibly some kind of subset of Goths, Hwæt from Sweden. And he comes over, and if you've seen that the animated movie with Angelina Jolie, he's like standing there in the prow of the ship, being all masculine, and I think probably also naked. I can't remember. And then he swims the rest of the way. And also the Danish countryside is like full of like giant ass mountains, which is not true. There are no mountains in Denmark, unless there's been like serious erosion since the 700s.
Okay. So you've almost also got a protagonist coming from another land that obviously they must have known about at least. So it's not just one; you're talking about two.
Mm-hmm. So they have knowledge of a tribe, a region in Sweden as well. And yeah, this makes perfect sense when you consider, as Matt pointed out, Redwall's grave in Sutton Hoo, where the artifacts are like almost like identical to artifacts that we find in Vendel graves, in the Vendel graves in Sweden, in Valsierra and Vendel. And so what we're dealing with here is, as we've also talked about before, when we talked with Martin Carver on this podcast, there is a cultural commonality here. There's a cultural relationship, community, you could even call it, in this northern European region. These the kings especially, and other magnates, they are trading with one another. They're exchanging goods in terms of like gifts and so on, establishing alliances, and the thing that probably breaks this down is Christianity, to be honest.
Yeah, I always thought that. Yeah, because like there's clearly always been trading networks there. And like that, I'm not doing too much about it, but like clearly that raid on Lindisfarne was retaliatory. But I think that was there ever a severance between the trade because of Christianity coming into England? I've always wondered the severance of trade for the rest of the Northern Europeans.
I think they're so Christianity has the rule that you don't trade with non-Christians.
Yeah.
So
this smells like Brexit all over again. Fucking
shit. I like. Well, okay. Well, I guess we're gonna get back on the Viking ships then. Well, now you don't have any allies either, so
that's it.
No, so yeah. There's something to be said for a boundary being set up here by Christianity because at the bare minimum you would have to be prim signed, so that's like a precursor to be getting baptized if you would be an acceptable trade partner. This is what we see happening a lot in the Viking Age. A lot of like those Scandinavians who are traveling to other parts of Europe that are Christian and the parts of Scandinavia that aren't Christian, they will have to get prim signed. So they do that, and that's also part of like how Christianity precipitates into the north. We see what appears to be so I mentioned how Saxony was invaded by Charlemagne. And what he basically does there is to establish this precedent in European history that also becomes crusades later on. You can invade a non-Christian country under the pretext that it needs Christianity. And that's the situation that Denmark in particular is dealing with, right? Because then Charlemagne, he pushes his border up to Denmark. Saxony used to be the buffer. We know that the Danish, whatever it is, central government, probably a king. We don't know if it's a king over the entire country or if it's like a local magnate or whatever. But we know that from Denmark, they're sending mercenaries down to fight against Charlemagne's push into Saxony. They harbor the king, the Saxon king Widukind, for a period as well. So that tells you that there's a polity in southern Scandinavia that is interested in keeping a buffer zone between itself and that Frankish kingdom that is expanding northwards, right? And bringing Christianity with it. And what we're seeing in the 900s is that the favorite Danish version of the how we became Christian is that there was this bishop from Hamburg named Poppo who convinced the Danish king that it would be a good idea, and he carried like white hot iron in his hands and proved that Christianity was awesome, something like that. And that's how the king converted to Christianity. Now, there's another story which is favored by North Atlantic sources, Icelanders, for instance, which is basically that Denmark was invaded by the Germans and forcibly converted to Christianity. And I think that one might actually be the true one. The other one sounds a little too much like we're trying to cover something up here.
That's the one you tell after you've invaded and forcibly
after you got your ass kicked. It's like, I meant to let that happen,
Yeah, exactly.
And so what's happening here is that like process continues, right? You basically have like Denmark is being treated by the German Empire the same way as Saxony was a couple of centuries earlier, right? Or a century and a half.
Okay. So let's pull it back to the story. So we've got a Danish kingdom, I guess. They've got a problem with a monster. They bring in a handsome fellow from Sweden
with long, golden, wavy hair. Because
exactly,
that's what Swedes always look like.
So he comes in. So where do we go from there?
So what happens next is, of course, they're hanging out in the hall, like testing out the situation. Monster comes around, Grendel, right, and eats some of the men. Eventually vanquished, right, and this is where I start getting iffy on the story. So next level is that he cuts the arm off. Matt, help me out.
He strips himself naked because Beowulf strips himself naked because Grendel has no weaponry or armor and he thinks it's unfair. So he strips down to his bollocks and then fights him and rips his arm off. That's
how it goes.
Display the arm in the hall as like some great trophy of the battle.
Yes.
So is Grendel ever a beautiful woman like in the movie?
No.
So that's just a modern thing for the film.
Yeah, the modern film, that Ray Winston one's like a really weird Freudian thing. So I think it links Hrothgar as the father of Grendel, and then it links Beowulf as the father of the dragon. But in the original, it's literally... I think that I've seen the comparison that is so the three monsters seen in Beowulf match pretty much identically to an Anglo Saxon manuscript written in Latin called Liber Monstrorum. So there's three different types of monsters: you the human or the human type, the bestial, and then the worm, the serpent. Which you have here. You have the Grendel, which is the bestial. Then you have you have the sort of bestial man, and then you have the mother, and then you have the dragon. So it matches identically to what the Anglo Saxons classed as monsters at the period when it was probably written.
Yeah,
that's where you have it.
Mm-hmm.
But the film is weird, like really weirdly Freudian. I don't know why they. It's a good twist, like modern for the modern era. But the original one is literally just man beats monster.
Yeah, and see, there's an interesting element to this that seems to relate to internal processes of Scandinavia. We know that in the 500s, the religion shifts focus. Prior to the 500s, we see a lot of religious activity that is centered around lakes and bogs, ritual deposits of different kinds. They don't stop in the 500s. They continue into like the thousands even though that's where everybody's officially Christian at that point. But there is a shift also in focus in the 500s from that lake to the hall, the temple building, and also the king as or the magnate, the jarl as like an important ritual figure as well. This is where sacral kingship seems to become a big deal in Scandinavia, and also his hirth, the retinue that sits in that hall.
Yeah,
and the stories that they tell. So that's like all Odin stuff. Like, if you're reading the Eddas and so on, you'll see like all the Odin stuff basically mirrors that sort of like ideology that seems to come around in the 500s in Scandinavia. And this also seems to be mirrored in that poem. Like there's this relationship between the lake and the hall site, the temple sites, and so on. And there's something to be said for this, if in like a pre-Christian context, this poem actually addressing that religious shift, focusing more on the hall than that lake, and that is why it's the being from the lake is monstrous and all that stuff. So there's something there that's happening, which is quite interesting, right? Because that tells us then that whomever composed this in an English context was aware of this, and it then seems to be framing all of that also in a Christian sense, right? Yeah. You can make the argument too that shift in focus in the 500s in religion in Scandinavia is also like paving the way for Christianity in different ways. Yeah. So yeah, like the poem, in my opinion, in so many ways tells you that there was a very intimate relationship, cultural relationship between the British Isles, the Anglo-Saxon area, and Scandinavia in general. And this makes perfect sense because, we can see from other stories that Scandinavians have an intimate relationship to other parts of Europe based on same migration era connections that are being established. Think of the Rökstone in Sweden. It has like it references Theodoric the Great, Lombardian king, right? so these Swedes, they know what's going on in northern Italy. They have legends about it and all that stuff, and it's meaningful to them. There's the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. It's like probably the most important story in Viking Age and medieval Scandinavia, which is like engraved in stones in Sweden. We find it in woodwork in Norway. We find it in ballads and folk tales and sagas and all that stuff in the North Atlantic and in Denmark and so on. And that's, what is it, like Hessen, Bavarian territory that we're dealing with there, right? Mm-hmm. So to the Scandinavians, there are all of these cultural connections that they, in different ways, are, cultivating and keeping alive, even when they break down on the other side.
So do you think the story could have originated in Denmark and then come over with settlers and then been told around the campfire almost? And because it's an entertaining story, it's kind of caught on and then being retold? Or do you think it would have originated by Anglo Saxons of a foreign land?
So I think I think parts of it could probably have originated in Scandinavia. Parts of it are also obviously later reworkings, like what Matt is pointing out in the chat here, that there's reference to Grendel being the offspring of Cain, which is a very typical a Christian interpretation of what monsters are. Monsters themselves, in so many ways, have an important function in Christianity because they demonstrate the opposite of God's law for nature, right? That's what a monster is for, is to basically tell you, like, God's creation is this, and this is an abomination, right? And that attitude is very present in the poem as well, which means that it's gone through a filter of interpretation too.
Yeah, there's also like they call it like is it Heathen's Hope, and then they mock him for being a brave warrior, but also for being proud of being brave. For Beowulf being so valiant, but that source of pride is a sin. So it's definitely that sort of Christian like squint eye looking at it, but like the sort of four like previous tellings of the story. So it's still a great story.
Absolutely.
Shitty Christian twist on it.
That happens, but hey.
Yeah. So it's like they want to tell the story, but also want to diminish it a little bit.
Yeah, it's still like it's cult, like their culture has varied slightly, but it's still culturally important. Like the Anglo, I think quite a lot as the Anglo Saxons are looked upon as a sort of weak Christian men in dresses, but like this is a warrior culture, and I think the warrior culture, even though it was sort of at least by like sort of 700 and like later on, it was sort of like watered down ever so slightly, not just before Christianity, but once they settled. I think that sort of like warrior ideal. I mean, we still look back on the King Arthur and the chivalric of the post-Norman conquest. We still look at that like that chivalry sort of thing, and that's hundreds of years ago. So I think even back the Christian Anglo-Saxons would have seen the Beowulf and the early sort of warrior poet as still something to look up to and still something to sort of be admired. But obviously being written in Wessex by a monk, it's never going to be 100% boasting about the pagan Beowulf, or if it was a pagan, or sort of the pagan ideology of the brave warrior. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really good point, and it's something to keep in mind too, that just because they convert to Christianity doesn't mean that they throw out all the cultural elements that existed before. They Christianize them. That's usually how it goes. And that's also what happened to Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. He was Christianized. He was and we see this with so many elements in the saga literature as well. Like
there's even in the modern day, you only have to look at like normal folklore. So folklore is how I got into like Anglo-Saxon, just by I really love folklore. I love the folklore of England and stuff. But I mean, Jack and the Beanstalk, like the most basic of things, like giants don't exist in Christian literature. Giants existed pre-Christian era. They just got absorbed into fairy tales rather than being something of the land. So all these sort of things you see in folklore they predate the Christianity of this land and obviously other areas and that, but it's just given a new twist on it. But it's always been there as a sort of thing that we've looked towards, but just given a Christian twist.
Yeah, the best example is, of course, elves in Iceland, if you ask me. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like elves in Iceland. They're basically just like the spirits of the land. They were definitely there before Christianity showed up, and then in contemporary or close to contemporary, like 19th century folklore, we get an explanation for why elves exist. So they were basically the unwashed children that Eve tried to hide from God when God came to visit, right? and so like that's a great also. How can you? This is what I don't get. How can you hide something from an omniscient God? Anyway, that's just like that's a theological question that's going to keep me up at night. But yeah, so that's like that's sort of like the Christian twist on it, basically saying, okay, yeah, so that's why these unseen people that live in the hills exist, right?
Yeah, yeah, you keep it. But we're going to just class it as something that's not quite real. I mean, that's what it sort of became. Yeah, like you can have it still, but we're just going to say that it's slightly more like in the background and in the shadow and bring more enlightened thought to the front. But yeah.
I imagine that's something that probably happened slowly. I don't imagine that you just the Christians went in and then stripped everything away and said, okay, you now believe in this. Or in like, in particular, the stories of the monsters, they can't have just gone and said, right, forget all your stories. So it seems smarter that you would incorporate them in some way, almost as a comfort blanket to leave something there, but also then introduce the Christian side of things as well.
Well, the thing is actually, so this is the interesting thing that I think a lot of people have like this idea that Christianity comes along and then basically fucks up everything of the pre-existing culture, and that's definitely not what happens in medieval Europe. To the contrary, medieval Christianity preserves so much culture that already existed, because medieval Christianity is a very different thing than the type of Christianity that we're familiar with now, and also that we know historically from our own mythos about the modern era. The thing that really messes up folk culture in Europe is the modern era. Like in the introduction of modern institutions, and especially industry, is the thing that messes with people's culture, not just in Europe, across the world. Like outside of Europe, it's known as colonialism. Inside of Europe is known as like different kinds of oppression, right?
Urbanization.
Yeah,
and that's what we have in England as well. Like you look at just the folklore we have of England, like only really exists in the rural areas now. May Queens, sort of May Days, Morris dances. You don't really see them in the inner city, and that's sort of like that's why you don't get elves and spirits that live in the middle of fucking Hackney. They live somewhere in the deep dark woods of Sussex. You know what I mean? So, but like with like Beowulf, like saying Beowulf, like. These were, I still think, even at the time when they were written, obviously with a Christian perspective, even if it was written before Alfred was known to have used the dragon serpent as like a banner, or that was meant to be used around the Anglo-Saxon period. Alfred's name itself literally means elf folk. So even during the Christian context, Anglo-Saxon, if we look at it as an Anglo-Saxon thing, even though Beowulf is a heathen thing rewritten by Christians or reshown by Christians, the actual elements themselves haven't changed at all. Like it's very culturally part of the Anglo-Saxon era, and Northern Europeans later on would carry on keeping it.
Yep.
Yeah.
It seems like Christians are very good at kind of taking or using the religion to explain other things, like adapting quite easily to explain outside influences, so that the people they want to believe in Christianity, it kind of gives a reason to it. So it's like those exist, and we're going to adapt Christianity, or at least incorporate into it, so you can kind of believe in these things, and it's going to damage your belief in Christianity, because it exists, but God let it happen, or it happened for this reason because it's the children of somebody else. And almost the way that they do with science today, you get things that come along that question it, and Christianity is really good at adapting and changing and twisting to suit new ideas that come up and kind of disprove it. They kind of go, oh no, hang on a minute, this is actually this is actually what it meant.
And so there's something to be said for that. An ability in Christianity to adapt to local cultures in different ways. That's not to say that other religions don't also have it. You can find a lot of. I mean, Islam has been doing it too throughout the centuries, and you will find, just like you find Christian cultural versions of Christianity, you can also find cultural versions of Islam in different ways. And then you have different periods where you see sort of like a spike in some kind of zealousness or piety or whatever you want to call it, right? Where, like, for instance, in Greece, it's quite interesting to see how the Kurbani sacrificial rituals, they have like on and off, like they've existed forever, and there's like decent evidence to suggest that they originate in like pre-Christian rituals in the Greek area. And this is basically like you slaughter a goat, and there's like a story that goes with it, and then you have a giant cookout. It's awesome. And like so like in a certain century, you'll see the church like being like, "Oh, this is some old pagan stuff. We need to get rid of it." And in another century, you'll see the church being like, "Oh, this is like references to Jesus and the Lamb and all kinds of things and so on," right? So you go back and forth like that. And you see that with Christianity in all areas, and the same with Islam too, right? Like some periods. In the 1700s in Scandinavia, you had like priests running around trying to blow up like the rocks that were associated with like folk tales, these giant boulders lying around. It's like, oh, this boulder is said to have been put there by a troll. I need to blow it up because we need to get rid of pagan stuff, right? And then in the 19th century, it's like, oh, this is like an awesome folk tale, guys, and like here's how that fits into like this Christian worldview. Boom, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how it usually goes.
I think that's something to probably remember as well. The one thing I always try to remind myself when thinking about this kind of stuff, that you're talking about, let's say Beowulf was created in the 700s and then written down in the 1100s. You're talking about a 400-year gap. Now, it's easy when you're just speaking about it to just think of it as that. It's gone. But you're talking of generations upon generations of different people telling the story. And if you just look at the difference in modern age from generationally from today back 60 years ago, it's completely different the way that people think what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's cool, what's not cool. So you would assume that the same way over a 400-year gap, what was kind of the in thing would have changed and adapted. And so the story would have evolved and changed over the period of time.
Probably a little slower though, because nowadays we have such the communication systems, so it's easier to confuse each other. Yeah.
Isn't there something that wasn't much change in thought processes when you come to sort of like where it's all like ideals? It's only the cultural acceleration because brought on by the Industrial Revolution. Like prior to that, you see like Tudor era where they're still doing stuff that's very Anglo-Saxon, that's or like that sort of older era. The practices are still there. You still see sort of like very pagan, I suppose. Pagan practices is probably the best way to put it. Even if it's Christianized, like around the feast holidays and stuff, it's still very. I think sort of the loss that we've seen culturally has only been since the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization sort of era. I think before that, those sort of tales were. I mean, even the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf. I mean, they would have known about the scribes that wrote it down would have known about the Iliad, would have known about the Greek myths. That was something like, especially if it was written around the Alfred rule or post-Alfred rule. Like he was a scholarly man. They would have known a lot about the sort of Greeks. They tried a lot into Troy and that sort of area, sort of tried to be built into their genealogy. So they would have known about it. And I don't think there's been much of a shift going down the years. I thought they sort of kept that same sort of mentality of warrior culture carried on until the point that guns were invented, I suppose.
Here's something I've always wondered, and it might tell a lot about how the way my mind works. Do you think they would have had trends Like, not just like in the Viking Age, but like any older civilization, I guess. Do you think they would have had the trends the same way that we have? Like, what's cool? Like Vikings very much now at the minute is an in thing. You know, it's very much popular. It's on vogue. Like, do you think they would have had that? I think that's such a curious question. Like, do you think that, you know, people were sat around in camp in the Viking Age and someone maybe did something like, no, that's not cool, or that's like, oh, that's really cool. That's like the new thing. We're all going to start doing that, as if you wore your hat that way. That's fucking insane. Let's all now do that.
There's two instances that I remember from Anglo Saxon periods, and one is you have there's a Kentish style that's like very recognizable. Kentish style of brooches, the way it was worn, and you see that across the borders that was being copied, and even to the point where there are actual rip-offs, and like people are faking the Kentish look to look more Kentish. This is at a period when the Bretons and the Anglo Saxons are starting to mix, and so people were starting to adopt this fashion. But then, like later on, if you look into the Christian sources, with the Anglo-Saxon court trying to be like Charlemagne, trying to be like the Franks, and trying to have that adoption of that sort of the way we see Anglo-Saxons went is they were trying to adopt the European look, because the Europeans were the cool people. So that's why they started marrying into Europe. So that whole like trend set, and that's existed since migration period, when people were ripping off brooches up until the point when King Alfred was trying to be like the Holy Roman Emperor, like, or at least match him. That's why they sent them there, to sort of be trained by them and then come back and push that sort of cultural way of life back into the society, which is why we see Latin being adopted rather than Anglo-Saxon, because it's a cooler thing to write in rather than the sort of like grunting German. It's not. It's a beautiful language. I love Anglo-Saxon. I think it's much like the old Northern European, where it's really poetic. It has to be read out. Like Beowulf should like listen to Seamus Heaney. It has to be listened to. I don't think you can. Sigurd Bodie said the same thing, where they have to be said out loud. It has to be a Scopic, a bardic way of listening to it. I think if you read it like Shakespeare, it doesn't mean anything. You need the sort of the literary thing in there. But we kind of lost that when like Latin looked cooler, so everyone started doing Latin. That's why most of the manuscripts we have are in Latin. That's why Beowulf is so held up. There are other poems, but because it's so long, it's such a long poem, it's non-linear, it goes back and forth. I think that's why Beowulf is still held in such high regard, because it is Anglo-Saxon, it looks on an older time, and even though like it's written in like an eyes, like you said, with trends, it was written at a time when Christianity was the trend of the time. It was meant to be, but trends are seen. But I think that's why like Beowulf is so loved at the moment, or still loved.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and that's so we all know Snorri's Edda and the Eddic poetry as like sources to Nordic mythology, right? Did you all know that there's like a giant thick book out there that's also a giant source to Nordic mythology as well, that was written in Denmark?
Here we go.
No, it was
rolling my eyes here. Of course there is.
It was written in Latin. Like it's Saxo's History of the Danes. It goes through a bunch of Nordic mythology in different ways. A lot of it is something that he gets directly from Icelandic sources, but he's also got some poetry in there that was obviously an Eddic poem at one point that he then translated into some ridiculous Latin instead. So like, but see, it's a lesser known source because it's in Latin, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. There's like the Liber Monstorium, the one that links the parallels, the Beowulf. That's in Latin. I think because Anglo-Saxon is so scant, I think that's why we know more about it. I think because Latin became such the main predominant language, I think such rare pieces, especially with Beowulf being a singular manuscript, I think that's why it's been remembered. Whereas like the Danish one obviously being written in Latin, Latin's like, there's a dime a dozen. There's loads of those. We've got whole houses of like monasteries. Writing them. Yeah, loads of people do it.
But Saxo was, of course, writing in Latin because he wanted to make sure that everybody else in Europe could read his rantings, because that's really what they are, rantings. It's basically, Denmark is the greatest country in the whole world. Fuck the Germans. That's really what he wanted to say.
It sounds like you now, though. That's literally
what
Danish outlook.
No. Like, I think most Danes love the Germans.
Yeah, I think that's another thing.
Silence.
That's the thing with, I think with Anglo-Saxon, we were talking about earlier. I think there's a worry, isn't it? Obviously, if you say Germanic rather than like referring to the old Anglo-Saxons rather than Old English, you refer to it as a Germanic time. I think there's a lot of like, it's quite raw even now to refer to it as Germanic. So I think that's why Anglo-Saxon probably works as a safer.
There's some weird hang-ups about that, and also a lot of like loss of knowledge, especially here in the US. Like people don't understand if there's like they don't necessarily understand like what is the crossover between like Scandinavian and Germanic. People see these as very different.
I think it all stems back to the fucking Nazis fucking everything up. I just think the word Germanic, even though you're talking about a time that's so far before that that even happened, it's still that trigger word of just even having Germany in it. And I think with some people it just has that, especially if you're not used to hearing it and you're not involved in this sort of community. And if you're a complete outsider, you hear the word Germanic, and I think
every time I do it. My wife's face every time she sees me draw down a rune, she's like, "Fuck!" Like,
really?
She doesn't understand at all. Like, she sees me draw. Like, if I do like an image and I follow, and she's like, "Oh, please no." Like, I think like you said, outside of this community, I mean, there's that bollocks with the Trump podium apparently looking like a Thala because they're like the Odal room because they're trying to bring in something that wasn't. I think outside the community, that link to the 30s and the 40s is. Because the swastika was an image that predated them. We had it on British military clothing. So, yeah, I think the term Germanic is complicated even now, which is a shame because the Germanic peoples were fucking incredible and like really fascinating. I think that's why I love the Anglo-Saxons as they are, because it's just such a fascinating time period. And, it waters itself down into the Scandinavians invading later on, but like the Germanic people were like an amazing sort of tribal group. And it's a shame that to class it as Germanic sort of gives such bad connotations nowadays.
Well, see, this is like the main thing, the main reason why, when you're into this kind of stuff, you need to be really clear about how white supremacists can fuck off, because they're the ones destroying it for the rest of us. They're the ones using our symbols, our words, our culture, all that stuff for exclusionary, nefarious means, and that's why we don't like him.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. Just that's why we've said on the podcast so many times, and I personally believe it's the people outside of this community that need, without not educate might not be the right word, but at least so they know the difference between the terms and what is like racist and what isn't, and what's just part of history. Because if you're not into this, all these terms just snowball into, it's like, anybody could talk about something that we have absolutely no idea about, and if it's the first time you ever hear about it, everything just sounds the same, everything just gets entwined, it all just sounds very similar. So when you're an outsider and you hear these terms, they'll say, oh well, they all must just be racist. And that's what I really truly believe, that unfortunately, so that's how some people will just see it now, because they see it on the TV that some asshole is flying a fucking flag with something like Nordic or Norse on it. And the news channel will say white supremacist fucking flying, or will link it to Nordic culture or Viking, and then in their mind they just go, oh, okay, well then everything from there is now racist, and they don't think any more of it. They just walk on, carry on with their life. But the next time it comes up, they make that link. Viking stuff's racist, and then it kind of spreads with somebody else, and you don't ever really re-educate or change the ideas.
Yeah, it's the same with that's the hard thing about doing trying to redo Anglo-Saxon artwork, is there's a lot of swastikas in it, and then especially in the migration period, they're quite well hidden. So that's always an issue, trying to redraw it, because it's a shame to have to remove something because the meaning is so sullied. Because it's a fantastic image when you see it used as it is in the original artwork. It's a very prominent piece. I mean,
it's a tough one to try and reclaim that, though, isn't it? That's really a tough one for people to try.
You can. There's no coming back from it. The solar wheel has been readopted, and that's sort of like it's working now. Drop the arms, and the runes are going to be. The Seagull's always going to be a bit of one that's always quite contentious. I think Odal rune has come back now and it looks fine, but I think the swastika is unfortunately just like lost to time. I don't think we'll ever see it again as an imagery that can be used openly in anything. I mean, I'd love to use it in artwork. I think that as a symbol of Thor, it's a shame because it's like a glorious symbol for Nor, but I just don't think it's something we can ever readopt, which like really sucks. And you can't even make variations of it because a variation of it is still.
If it looks anything remotely like, then somebody's
put arms on it. You could work it into a pattern, and you're still not going to do it. The old cremation urns used to have patterned to the point where you wouldn't notice the swastika until you get up close. But once you've noticed it, it's there, and it's like it's not really touched again. I've tried to do other patterns that like resemble it, but not enough for it to be classed as, and it's still as a Western Germanic meaning. It can't be touched. Like you can do it if it's doing Tibetan art, or if it's doing sort of a East Asian Oriental art and sort of the Thai artwork, but it's undoable now. So
it's a tough one because it was used for such atrocious things. Like me and Sarah were talking about it today, that like the Holocaust might be the single worst thing ever to happen in the history of humankind. Like it's definitely, if it's not the worst, it's definitely up there. It's one of the worst things that humans could ever have done to other humans. So when you get a symbol that is so closely linked to that, and it is synonymous with it, it's on the flags, it's hanging from buildings, it's on the uniform, that you just cannot, I don't think you can ever separate the two anymore. You can't just take it apart. And it's sad, but equally, I think we just have to kind of accept that's gone. And that doesn't mean that if you see it on older inscriptions that you have to like attack them and call them racist, because you're not. You have to also understand that there is a difference, but I think we also have to understand that going forward, it's a tough one to use because it is now synonymous with such a bad event that will without a doubt will upset people, because there are still survivors and family of survivors around, so they're going to see it and it is going to upset them. So you have to take that into account.
Yeah, I think it's more important to pay attention to what those people feel than anything else in that regard. Like, if you walk around in Scandinavia, in towns, like you'll see the swastika in different places. Like it'll be painted on an old building in sort of like a pattern work or something like that. There's like several churches too, in Denmark, I know, that have swastikas in like the aisle seats. It has nothing to do with like Nazi era or anything like that. They're usually
it's the Indo-European use, isn't it? Because it's seen in Greek artwork. You see it everywhere. I don't think there's a culture on Britain that hasn't used it. So it's such an old symbol, but it's amazing that within 10 years it's just fucked. Like, it's like millennia. I must have got millennia of use, over a millennia of use. And then,
I mean, I certainly would defend like not removing, because I do not believe that you should learn from things, but I don't think you should. I think everything has to remind you of what to do and what not to do. But things like that, in the church, Matthias, that doesn't link to the Nazi era. Some people will be like, well, you've got to remove that. You've got to take that out. Whereas I would firmly say, you don't. Things are different times, and you have to understand that some things meant one thing once and one thing another. And going forward, maybe don't use it. But I would certainly defend not going and taking things down and ruining it, and changing things that didn't have that meaning.
It's education over ignorance. So that's always going to have to be a thing. You can't just be ignorant to something. You can't like cover your eyes and like say like, and sort of like fingers and ears. Like you have to just educate people on what the image, like what's happening now with the sort of the modern revival, second modern revival of sort of the Viking era imagery, like post World War II. It's re-education. I mean, York, you see like quite a lot of the runes around, but it's very safe reason why it's been shown. So I think it is a re-education of the masses needs to be done to show that, not so much like a reclaiming, but just to show that the context predates things that were used for in the turn of the century. But sausage is still dead.
Awesome. Let's wrap this up. Because Matthias, we're gonna jump on and do our Vikings watch along show after this, the first ever episode. See what happens. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, no, me too. I'm so much looking forward to this.
Yeah, Matt, you can stick around and watch with us if you want.
I'm going to bed, mate. I've been up since.
No, thank you very much for joining us.
Not at all.
And thank you very much, for all the work you do for us. Obviously, people can get your work on our t-shirts. You do all the artwork. You do an amazing amount of artwork for us behind the scenes, and you are truly, a member of the people that go into making the podcast. Obviously, me and Mathias just sit here and speak, but obviously, the you behind with the artwork, the Shan who does the editing, there's Harrington that does the sits in and produces.
Yeah,
there's much more than just man and Mathias's ugly mug speaking about bullshit. So no, huge thank you to everything you do. Yeah, and like someone said, they love your artwork in the chat, which is true. I love your artwork. I think you have a very unique style, which is so important today as well. It's easy to copy what's gone before and lose individuality. Whereas I think it's important to with what, or at least I think what you do is you look at the old stuff, interpret into your own work, but you also keep individuality in that, in the sense that you can, I can pick your work out of anywhere. I think most people can, because you've got your own style, but also have the history behind it as well, which I think is really cool. I think that's probably why your artwork has blown up so much recently, and it's doing so well. Yeah,
it's called saturation. Just fucking upload enough until it's just in everyone's eyes.
Hey, throw enough shit at a wall and something's going to stick, mate.
Yeah, mate, yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. Should probably do something again in the future about Anglo Saxon migration era, because that'd be good.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, any time. Give people a shout out, let them know where they can find your work. Anyone who's not already familiar with it, like I said, they've seen it on our artwork, but you've got so much more than that. You've got your own stuff. You've got Lord of the Rings interpreted stuff going on in there,
Yeah, find me at the Saxon Storyteller. That's just on Instagram, and that's the only place you'll find me. I don't have the time to be doing anything anywhere else. There's links on my bio if you want to buy any stuff. And yeah, that's about it really. I try and upload as much as I can when I can. I uploaded some this evening, and then
awesome, man.
Find me. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Matthias, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on Instagram by my name, Mathias Nordvik. Yeah, that's it.
That's it. Up to me.
Well, I mean, you can always give me a list of things you'd like me to rant off.
I've wrote a little list now, so I feel like I'm getting good at it.
Wonderful.
No, so if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Usually it's best on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. It's the best place where people are going to see it and find it. Leaving a review helps people find the podcast. So if you can leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review, that would be awesome. Obviously, if you want to support the show further, you can find us on Patreon. It's just the Nordic Mythology podcast on there. You get access to a bunch of material, but more importantly, now we're going to start the Vikings watch-along show where me and Mathias are going to sit down and watch an episode from the Vikings, talk about it. We're going to have a laugh. It's going to be lighthearted. It's going to be good fun, but we're also going to learn a lot about what's real, what's not real. Apparently, they can all fucking speak to each other, which is still blowing my mind. So yeah, no, that's going to be fun. You get that at any level on Patreon, whether it's the £5 a month or the £20 a month. You're going to get access to that extra show. We're going to record that after the main show every week. So come along, watch the main show, then jump in and watch that with us after. You can find us on Facebook, Nordic Mythology Podcast, Instagram, the same. And then obviously our website, if you want to pick up any merch, you have the beautiful T-shirts that Matt did for us. The Stag and the Snake, I think, is my favorite T-shirt that I've ever, I've been involved in printing. That's with Horns of Odin and Nordic Mythology Podcast.
Are you ever going to send any of those to me, by the way?
I am, yes. I'm just keeping them all. No, you are going to get some for sure. Let's not talk about that on air. No, just calling me out like that. No, they're somewhere on their way to you. Like I said, that's one of my favorite, maybe my favorite T-shirt that I've ever printed. And I think you absolutely fucking knocked it out of the park with that design. The colors are beautiful. The colors are beautiful. It's awesome, man. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, pleasure.
And I'm just waiting to be wearing it. Like that. That's like I've been.
Yeah, me too.
All I do.
Oh, the sat behind me as well. It's been that busy that I haven't been able to tell Sarah to do it. Fuck, I'm getting me in trouble. Right. No, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone that's listened, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.